To everyone. We have the dubious honor of having the first panel after lunch on the last day of a conference. So we're going to try to keep this as interesting as possible, and we've sort of tweaked the format a little that was given to us originally by ORF to help that as well. So how we're going to go, we are essentially going to be talking about security incident reporting, but we're going to be talking about security incident reporting from the perspectives of the relationships shared between governments and corporations. It's important, I think, to distinguish the fact that security vulnerability reporting is often conflated with incident reporting and breach notification in most conversations. We're going to try to limit this to security vulnerability reporting, but if there are questions about the overlap between security vulnerability reporting and, say, incident reporting in the form of questions that come out from the audience, the panel will be more than happy to do so. So how we're going to go about this is have a quick round of introductions from the speakers, and then after that I'm going to give about a 5-minute introduction to the topic. And then after that, using some of the guiding questions that were given to us by ORF, we will largely have a conversation around how security incident reporting is important and what are the different ways in which it can be reformed, especially using cooperation. So now if we could have a round of introduction starting with John.
Hi. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Observer Research Foundation and to this CyFy conference for extending the invitation to speak here. My name is John Miller. I'm a vice president for cybersecurity, for global policy and law, focusing specifically on cybersecurity and privacy for the Information Technology Industry Council, otherwise known as ITI. ITI is a global trade association with members based around the globe, representing all aspects of the technology, information technology ecosystem, and I'll leave it there.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nappinai, and I beg to differ from Udbhav. I love the post-lunch session. If you're all taken the effort to be here, that's a reflection of how lovely it is. So looking forward to a great session out here. I'm a practicing lawyer in the Supreme Court and the Bombay High Court. I'm an author of a book titled Technology Laws Decoded. I've been specializing in this field for over 17 years, and I'm looking forward to a very active session today.
You know, Nappinai, I think it's kind of a 50-50 thing. There are 2 rooms, and people have to come somewhere. So, so I think a lot of it actually depends upon.
I always believe it was definitely just for me.
So I think a lot of it depends upon what we talk about and whether we are able to keep everybody's attention. I'm Mohan. I wear a couple of hats, but I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Afilias. Afilias is a domain name registry company. We are probably best known worldwide for 2 things. One is we manage all the technology and services for .org. Worldwide, and we're also the technical service provider for .in, the India's top-level domain, as well as Bharat and all the other top-level domains in India in the local languages. I'm also a charter member, a founding member of the ICANN Security and Stability Advisory Committee, and I'm the liaison from that committee to the board of ICANN. For those of you who don't know ICANN, it's a global coordinating body whose mission is to focus on the coordination of the security and stability of the fundamental identifiers in the internet namespace, and those tend to be domain names, those tend to be IP addresses, and also tends to be protocols. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jiten. I'm a security researcher, probably the odd one out in the panel, the troublesome guy, you can say. I look after a consortium of Indian security researchers and ethical hackers. I also run a threat intelligence startup focusing on geopolitical intelligence and mapping them into cyber conflicts. We also provide threat intelligence reports for different organizations based on their requirements, and we are very active into the security field. So yeah, looking forward to speaking from the perspective of the researchers who notify breaches and security incidents and what the problems they face.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Udbhav Tiwari, and I work as a program officer for the Central for Internet and Society, which is a non-governmental think tank based out of Bangalore and Delhi. That primarily works in different areas of technology policy. Now, to quickly start off the session, what I'll be doing over the next 5 minutes is essentially laying down the field in terms of what is security incident reporting, how has it normally been carried out, especially in the context of India so far, and what are some of the biggest problems that both governments and corporations are facing when they want to carry out effective security incident reporting, right? Security incident reporting is essentially the act of any entity notifying a centralized authority of the fact that there is a vulnerability in either the hardware or the software of a particular system. Now, these vulnerabilities can be design flaws, and sometimes are very much like physical flaws actually present in boxes that are computers, or they can also be flaws in programming or design or coding, as well as implementation, especially in the case of open source projects. Now, security incident reporting in the context of computer emergency response teams has been around since the first computer emergency response team was set up in Carnegie Mellon University by the US government almost now 2 decades ago. And since then, there has been an explosion in the field of security incident reporting, especially with CVE, which is like the common vulnerability standard that is now used quite globally for most reputed software and hardware products in order to have standardized numbers for vulnerabilities that exist in software systems. However, due to the exponential growth of technology since the CERT was set up in the United States of America, and now various other CERTs have been set up over the globe, the sheer amount of software and hardware that exists in the world makes a centralized database of every single vulnerability that exists in every single system something that is almost an impossible task to really maintain. And most governments have reacted to this by initiating programs domestically that allow private players as well as security researchers to report vulnerabilities to the CERT, who then takes a twofold responsibility. The first responsibility is of notifying other relevant players in the field of the fact that such a vulnerability exists. For example, the Indian CERT also operates a website that has an entire section dedicated to security vulnerabilities that it both gets from international organizations as well as ones that it finds out from original research and security vulnerabilities that are notified to it once they are vetted. The second obligation that the CERT has is to coordinate with the original developer of that software and to help them to whatever extent possible in developing a patch or a fix to the vulnerability. This is of key importance because merely notifying a vulnerability, in fact, can be more harmful than helpful, because what it does is it notifies hackers of the fact that there is a vulnerability in a system that can be exploited. Now, this is not blanketly true. You can give details of a vulnerability that hide that without really giving away how to exactly exploit the vulnerability, but it's a very good way to find a target at the back of a particular software or of a particular hardware. So it's very important that fixes or patches to vulnerabilities come out at a really fast pace, or at least as fast as the vulnerability notifications themselves come out. Now, after having sort of given a sort of brief overview, the two main issues that are currently plaguing the security incident reporting scene in both India and abroad are, one, cooperation, because there is definitely a trust deficit between corporations or software developers and the amount of trust they repose within the computer emergency response teams of their respective national jurisdictions. This is for one, like the two main reasons for this are, one, they're fairly uncertain whether the government will themselves utilize the vulnerability in order to exploit that software. So for example, if state-sanctioned hacking, if a government is to receive, say, a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows that it should notify, and instead of choosing to not notify it, it decides to use that to carry out targeted hacking on criminals or terrorists or other elements of society, then that's something that many software developers and corporations think is too much of a risk factor, and that's why they choose to fix the vulnerabilities internally before reporting them to the government. And the second problem is that there is that the cooperation needed in order to ensure that all vulnerabilities are specifically shared with the relevant stakeholders in that ecosystem is something that, at least in India currently, only the banking industry has actually managed to get up and running, where there is an organization set up by the RBI that notifies banks of vulnerabilities and other security incidents when they happen anywhere in the ecosystem so that they can prepare for it. Now, having set that context, I would like to start the discussion as a free-flow conversation by asking Nappinai the first question of what she thinks the legal and regulatory obligations for security incident reporting in India are, as well as how she thinks they should be fixed.
Okay, it's not just what I think, it's the way it is, Udbhav. So we do have a fairly robust regime in India. You have the CERTs, which were established after the Information Technology Act, or to call it a shorter name, IT Act, was amended. The CERTs function under a couple of rules which were framed in 2013, which talk about primarily what we are discussing today of cybersecurity incident reporting. Now, in these rules, they distinguish between cyber incident and cybersecurity incident. And they also distinguish cyber vulnerability reporting. Now, the broad distinction in these three heads is that they make it obligatory for entities like intermediaries or service providers to report cyber security incidents and cyber incidents, and it is discretionary for individuals and other players to report it. As far as the quid pro quo, there is a carrot and stick approach in this, the regulatory regime that we have. The stick first. If you do not, it is mandatory for you to report, and if you do not report it, then there is a violation which can, result in a penalty, which will be imposed by the adjudicating authority. And after the CERT calls upon somebody to give some information, if they fail to do it, it can also result in criminal action. But there, the only restriction or the check and balance that's been put in is that it's only the CERT which can file this case. Now, the carrot is that the CERT says that they will use this information to provide some protective or preventive measures. I think the discussion today would probably, focus on how effective the carrot really is, and also probably how stringent are they when they are implementing the stick too. And finally, I think the one place where we really need to look at regulation is on the data protection aspects of reporting. Up till recently, there was opacity with respect to data protection and our fundamental right in India, but today there is absolutely no ambiguity. The Supreme Court has unequivocally said that we own it, it's our fundamental right. But having said that, we are awaiting a data protection law in this field, and once that comes out, the CERTs will have to relook whatever rules have been put down to see what is it that can be balanced out between data protection, contractual privacy, and statutory requirements.
Thank you. John, would you have any comments to make with your understanding of the same legal and regulatory regime in the United States of America?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's interesting listening to you describe the sticks and the carrots, and I guess my assessment would be based on my admittedly not thorough understanding of the way that it works in India, that I don't think there's sufficient carrots at all. I will say in the United States, we went through approximately 5 or so years of very heated debates on what we kind of call more broadly cybersecurity threat information sharing. And I think it's important, again, to talk about how that's a little bit broader than perhaps the way that this panel is framed, but I think it's very important in the context of vulnerability sharing in particular. There's a definition of cyber threat information and cyber threat indicators under US law now that certainly includes vulnerabilities, but also includes a variety of other types of cyber threat indicators, which I'm sure our engineer on the panel can get more into some of the operational and technical indicators, but that's something that's definitely the case, is that we think of it as cybersecurity information sharing more broadly. And I think what's very interesting about the US model in particular is that there is not mandatory sharing required of private industry at all. Rather, it's a voluntary information sharing regime, And what the, and in particular, what the legislation, the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, provided in this regard is a number of different incentives. I mean, one that's very important from an industry standpoint, and that was a holdup for a number of years prior to this legislation, was targeted liability protections for companies. I mean, of course, there is going to be consequences to disclosing this type of information, and particularly if there's not liability protection. You know, another important incentive is you know, what we call FOIA protection, or Freedom of Information Act disclosure, mandated disclosures and protection as well. You know, there's also some critical infrastructure and operators, in particular in the U.S., have you know, regulatory requirements. So, you know, voluntarily handing your information over to the government and then having them bring a regulatory action against you is something that most companies and corporate lawyers don't really like very much. And then also there are contractual, do you want to jump in? I know, oh, sorry. Are you, okay. And then really importantly is privacy, actually, you know, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. You know, as we know, India is on the, you know, just at the beginning now of really considering developing a privacy and data protection regime, and a really modernized one, particularly in light of the recent Supreme Court decision. And I can tell you, over the 5 years of debates in the United States on what we should do about cybersecurity threat information sharing, the biggest set of issues involve privacy. And there's a number of different privacy protections that were put in place, and we can certainly get into those in more detail. But I think one that's very important is the notion of having a civilian interface in the federal government being the primary kind of point of receipt for the private sector data. And there's a whole variety of reasons for that, but you know, in particular in a post-Snowden world, there was a little bit of concern about handing things over directly to the NSA in this context. I'm happy to get into some more privacy discussion later, so thank you.
I thought Snowden actually showed that you don't even have to give it, they will anyway take it.
Well, you can't believe everything you read.
Yeah, I believe you. Well, there's just one thing I wanted to add to what you were saying, John, which is that, you know, when I was doing a comparison, what I came across was that the EU is kind of balancing out what is the regime in the US and India. It just asks for major incident reporting. It only expects that mandatory reporting from corporate entities. Whereas India has cast its net so wide to include even individuals, even if it is only discretionary. And I felt that the very process of casting the net too wide, making the definitions under the rules extremely vague and opaque, may actually be counterproductive.
Really quickly, I mean, I would say that I agree with that. I mean, you know, the point is of sharing vulnerabilities and cybersecurity threat information is not just sharing it, right? Sharing is a tool to hopefully improve cybersecurity and hopefully to improve situational awareness. Now, disclosing vulnerabilities on the front end to a National Cybersecurity Center or a CERT, and we can also get into whether or not we want to put all of this burden on the CERT itself, quite frankly, is very important. And then also, you know, of course, there's a very important operational response role that the CERT is playing, and that's more, you know, after an incident. And I think the European system is really focused on after-incident reporting, at least in their current system.
Thank you. So now moving on to the individuals from the private sector. Ram and Jiten, I think we'll go with Jiten first. According to you, what are the sort of checks and balances that are required in any legal or regulatory regime to ensure that the government can carry out its role of preventing cyber attacks and serving the public good while also respecting intellectual property and rights owned by corporations?
I think kind of debate and conversations we are having are mostly revolving around the method or, you know, the framework how an individual should report an incident. And then we are yet to figure out a difference between a breach notification or an incident reporting or a cyber vulnerability disclosure. I mean, we are trying to paint everything with the same brush, and then we are living in a situation where, at least in a country like India or other developing economies, If you take an example of India, we have a couple of disclosure programs going on here. CERT runs it with the name of incident reporting. The NCIPC, which is supposed to look after the critical infrastructure of India, they run a program with the name of responsible disclosure. But both of these programs are, mired with conflicts. I mean, these are all individual or institutional policies which are published on their websites. There is no executive order in place today. There is no legal policy framework in place today for responsible disclosure. Every single researcher or a hacker which makes any disclosure to these organizations stands vulnerable to any private criminal lawsuit from the organizations about whom the breach is notified. We do not have a policy, even with these organizations, that how an organization is supposed to behave, respond, or deal with the research notifier. I mean, there is no framework that nobody should go for a lawsuit, or there is no framework of a time limit that, after 2 weeks, a researcher is entitled to make the notification of the breach or the research public. There is no framework where we have which talks about the incentivization of such disclosures. We do have some bug bounty programs, but they are mostly run by the private entities. We do not have a government role in that. So, I mean, and then moreover, we are looking at, especially in developing economies where we are not the original manufacturer of software or equipments. We are mostly the, customers. In countries like India or other developing economies, we have management and consulting firms which carry out security audits. We have got CAs who give forensic reports, and we have then hackers who are threatened with jail terms and other irresponsible disclosure threats. So in this entire narrative, it's very important for the government to have an executive policy or a policy through an executive order or a policy framework where the guidelines for a person who's notifying the breach is also defined, as well as the institution about whom the disclosures are made are also very well written, that how they will behave, how will they respond to the the vulnerability. And the entire narrative becomes much more important when you look at the quantum of threat we face from that breach. So many a times, 9 years ago when I reported the first vulnerability in location APIs of topmost antiviruses and tools like Lookout, and I made a responsible disclosure through CV, the National Vulnerability Database Program of US. The first response I had from the 3 organizations was that you should not go there, you should come to us directly. And these are the same organizations which fund that program. So, I mean, we are seeing 2 different phases of these organizations. When you have an official, roundtable or policy meeting, everybody wants to have a government interface for the protection of private data. But when it actually comes to the, any breach or vulnerability about a particular organization, nobody wants to go to CERT, nobody wants to go to NCIPC, everybody wants to deal directly. And at the same time, when they want to deal, they want to arm twist, they want to threaten, they want to ensure that nobody talks about it and it doesn't come in the public domain. So it's very important for the government to have a framework which encapsulates the threats a researcher faces as well as the threat an institution may face, and then have a common understanding or a common ground and have a responsible disclosure policy in place.
Thank you so much. While we can also discuss the role the government plays, Ram, what is your take on how, as the CTO of one of the largest registrars in the world, how should a corporation deal with such scenarios? Should they choose to necessarily look at it always from via the government being a conduit for this information, or should they also set up independent windows where such reports can be submitted, and say if a bug bounty program were to exist, so the bug bounty program also be available for a vulnerability that is coming through the CVE system, or should it only be for vulnerabilities that are directly given to corporations?
Thank you. I think this really interesting discussion already. I think the fundamental issue is if you ask private corporations and you ask them to disclose information to a government entity, and there are regulations, there are requirements, there's a statutory requirement, of course, but I think the fundamental element that impedes this is trust. And if you really look at it, what are the components of trust, right? There are really 3 primary elements of trust. The first is competence, the second is integrity, and the third is benevolence, right? So let me just explain that for a second, right? So competence means that if you're disclosing information, you expect that the receiving side has sufficient and appropriate knowledge and expertise, okay? So they know what to actually do with the information that they're given. That's the first thing. And that's, in some ways, the most critical thing. The second part is some understanding of the integrity of the organization and what is going to happen to the information that you're provided. So there has to be some level of openness and honesty and transparency about what is going to happen to the information you're providing, right? Often you will find in government entities, you will find that second part tends to be occluded with things like this is about security, this is about national whatever it is. And the reality is that if you are obscure, you're less secure, right? But that's a second issue. The third part, what I call benevolence, really has to do with concern and care, right? So you have disclosed information to an entity. Not only do you want to understand that they have knowledge and expertise and that they're going to be open and transparent with the information, but most importantly, you want to have absolute clarity that the motivation for that organization's actions is going to be the concern and care of whoever they are mandated to look after. In many cases, it is the citizens of a country, it is the people who they have to look after, right? And I think if you have those three pieces properly set up, then in my opinion anyway, most private, public, whatever entities there are, you will find the barriers of sharing information to fall immediately. Today, of course there are corporate interests. A lot of companies have this mistaken belief that if there is a vulnerability, lack of disclosure is going to help them avoid liability. We know from multiple cases it is the opposite. Right? You sit on on information that is bad about your product or your company, the liability compounds over time, right? So you're better off being able to disclose it. But to disclose it, you need to understand that there is trust in whoever you're going to disclose it to. And the second element is that you also need to make sure that there is the capability of coordination, right? In 2007, at Afilias, we were part of a global group. There was a massive botnet that was infecting hundreds of thousands of computers all over the world. This is a botnet. It was called Configure, okay? And one of the things that it did was, this was a worm that infected lots of computers. What it did was, every day, it went and looked at a domain name. And whatever the domain name was, that domain name provided the primary controls of what that bot was supposed to do. Who it was supposed to attack, whether it was going to be dormant or whether it was going to be activated, right? Every day, there was a different domain name. Some days it was in .com, some days it was in .org, some days it was in .in, some days it was in .tw. But it was across a huge number of top-level domains, right? Now, we knew about this, and we ended up, there was no protocol for the coordination of this kind. So there are two pieces there. One is disclosure, and the second is action. Because if you go and tell people, hey, we found out that this worm is using domain names and now we're going to deactivate these domain names, all it takes is for the worm's creator to go change it, right? So this is where, if you look at it, the dual elements of trust combined with coordination of the disclosure, I think are critical if we want to get private industry and we want to get the public sector involved and coordinated.
Thank you so much for those very, very interesting points. But clearly, building capacity domestically and internationally in trust has started to become a point of discussion in this debate. John, given the fact that India and the United States of America enjoy what I think is one of the most comprehensive cybersecurity cooperation agreements currently in the world, at least bilaterally, what do you think can be done at an international level in order to make cooperation between national CERTs and other security agencies more fruitful when it comes to security vulnerability reporting?
Thanks. I mean, if I could, I would just like to react to a couple of the excellent points that Ram made about trust. And I mean, I think, number one, I mean, trust is also going to be very key in the international context in all of this. But specifically, you know, a couple of the points that I think, you know, just to mention on the, you mentioned that, you know, companies don't have a lot of confidence in what's going to happen to the information once they share it. This was another big point of debate. And it was usually framed as a privacy issue, and it certainly is in part a privacy issue when we're dealing about this. But what the information sharing legislation in the United States, you know, put forth were data minimization requirements, and there's a few different levels of that. I mean, minimization requirements on the private sector before sharing to kind of strip out unnecessary personal information. Then another set of minimization requirements imposed on the Department of Homeland Security, who's the receiving government interface for the information, to strip out any information before it shares the data back to the private sector or with other government entities. And that's an important point actually I don't want to lose, is that we really need two-way information sharing. It's often thought of in many places, I think sometimes including in India, as what private sector, give us all your stuff and we will help you. But it really doesn't, it's not a scalable solution to think CERT India is going to solve everyone's problems, right? And I think that goes to another one of the points you made about competence. I think we all are aware that there's, I think it's fair to say there's a global cybersecurity workforce shortage and skills gap. So it's just another reason why we really need private sector and public sector working together to, hopefully be able to respond to these threats while we're training, the next generation of workers. But on the international point, I mean, I do think that, one way, first of all, is to make sure that private sector stakeholders are a part of this conversation. I think, again, it took over 5 years probably to have an information sharing regime kind of set forth in the United States. I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of the type of real global information sharing that we're going to need to really address what are certainly global threats. I mean, you mentioned Configure, certainly that was a good example of a global threat. I think another important point is that, again, it's not just CERTs working with each other, but other parts of the government also coordinating. Certainly the equivalent, the Department of State in the United States, for instance. But at a more operational level, I mean, there does need to be sharing amongst intelligence agencies, and there's a dimension here in the kind of the counterterrorism context as well, where we really need increased sharing. You mentioned the relationship and between the United States and India generally. I mean, I think it was about a year or so ago that the cybersecurity cooperation framework was signed, which certainly had this as a piece of the puzzle, coordinated vulnerability sharing. But there's a whole bunch of other things too that really need to happen, not only on a bilateral basis, but ultimately on a multilateral basis. I know we have someone who knows quite a bit about the Budapest Convention in the room. I see Jain sitting over there, and that's trying to figure out how to leverage multilateral tools like that is going to make it a lot easier to hopefully scale some of these types of solutions. And then one other thing that I think is really the future, not only for state-to-state sharing, but again for private sector sharing amongst itself or private sector government sharing, is increased use of automated cyber threat and vulnerability information sharing. That's another piece of the solution that was developed in the United States to set up, again, the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, is essentially serving as a hub and making it easier for companies to share in an automated fashion using a couple of different sharing protocols that were developed, the STIX and TAXI protocols. And I think that's the future of information sharing. And so figuring out how to build capacity in other countries and governments so that we can all share this information much more quickly it's really going to be necessary to provide the type of situational awareness that we really need in this space.
Ram, that was a beautiful summation on trust. In fact, I would like to also draw from that to explain the question that Udbhav posed and probably touch upon the Budapest Convention and where India stands on that. We are talking here about, like John has already summed up, we are talking about a two-way sharing of information. There is an assumption that there is some benefit that's going to come out of it. India, John, also has similar provisions for anonymizing the data going forward. So CERT is required to anonymize the data which it will share with respect to cybersecurity incident or cyber incident or threats, etc. So we do have that. But one possible way we can look at, but I know it could be self-defeating in certain instances, is to probably give the option of remaining anonymous even at the stage of giving information about a cyber incident or a cyber vulnerability particularly. There is not, there's so much necessity when it comes to a regulatory regime for this level of disclosure where, and this is where the loophole lies, and that's where the 3 points that you summed up squarely cover that also, is that the CERTs or the governmental agencies has all the information. It is only third parties with whom they are sharing who get anonymized information. Udbhav had flagged this issue earlier of whether there is a possibility of governments themselves or the authorities misusing it. I would take it slightly a little bit further on the integrity and competence part which you mentioned, to say that it may not necessarily just be the government. I don't think that's a bogey. It could possibly, definitely happen. But I'll take it a little bit further to say that the competence with respect to security practices may not necessarily be sufficient to lend that trust, value to somebody to share it very easily. And what is it that the rules or regulations provide in that? All that they say is that CERT shall exercise reasonable best practices for ensuring protection. How much trust are you really going to have in sharing information with somebody who says, oh, no, we will try our best. The bit try comes in, the doors are closed then, right? So that's where I think what you talked about as competence and integrity comes into place. The benevolence aspect of it, I'm going to address that from the international perspective here. Now, John touched upon the Budapest Convention. Budapest is all about sharing information, and particularly with respect to seeing how best nations can cooperate in reducing or alleviating threat. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons why India has shied away from the Budapest Convention is the same trust deficit on the same 3 parameters that Ram flagged. They felt that, firstly, the Western nations had not been very benevolent to India in not involving them in the dialogue. As a stakeholder, they felt that they ought to have been participants in that and not merely roped in as a mandatory, the same stick approach over here. The second aspect is the competence and integrity. The whole trust deficit here comes from an assumption that this sharing, this cooperation may not necessarily be mutual. And it may be a one-way street where you sign up for something without knowing what you're really giving away. So I think that was a lovely summation which addresses both the national as well as the international aspect. I would close out with saying that international cooperation, okay, it's not like India refuses to cooperate internationally. It is doing it more as a dyadic dialogue. So they are having bilateral MOUs and treaties with, including for information sharing on cyber incident reporting, etc. But I would close out by saying that cooperation internationally, nationally, between private and public or private verticals individually has definitely helped. India had a recent example of huge child pornographic racket being broken, etc. So we have success stories coming out of cooperation. I think we now have to figure out a way of overcoming this trust deficit, which may in some parts be just a bogey, but in many parts a real threat.
Thank you. So now, just to give Ram sort of an opportunity to hear everyone's take on his summation, if Jiten, yeah, as a security research professional, like the rest of the panel has now, I think, made easily between 5 to 7 suggestions for what could improve the regulatory landscape. Are there any other suggestions that you would say suggest for capacity building, education, or other avenues that the government can also take in the security industry to sort of maybe inculcate an ethical disclosure requirement when it comes to cybersecurity teaching and incentivizing it using, say, tax breaks or other rewards or research grants?
I think more than tax breaks, it'll be good that if efforts are appreciated. I mean, I agree with Nappinai and John that, there is a shortage of skilled manpower. So, if there is a shortage of anything, the best solution is that you pull in everything what you have and you consolidate. So one good idea would be to consolidate the cyber threats intelligence, maybe at the level of ICANN or APNIC. For example, if somebody comes across about a botnet or a command and control IP address, instead of sharing with the local CERT, which may not do anything or which may sit over it, or which may not understand the gravity of it, I think there should be an option available to report it directly to APNIC or someone which controls that IP address range. And we all must understand that, despite of the difference of opinion, we may have what constitute terrorism or a terror content or hate content or a malware or a virus, state-sponsored or a private actor, non-state actor. The fair use, we all have a fair use policy. APNIC, when it gives the IP range to a local ISP, say, for example, an ID or a PTCL in Pakistan or some Chinese IP internet service provider, everybody has some sort of fair use policy in their different contexts and terms. But so whenever there is an abuse, the option should not be only available to CERT to report it to another CERT. Option should also be available to individuals to report it to foreign CERTs or a consolidated body or an interface where they can directly report. And then there has to be a coordinated action. There has to be some action taken report. If I give you an example, very recently in India, there was a police officer who made a claim that he had arrested 7, 8 guys who were involved in stealing data from putting fake data into Aadhaar servers. Now, here is a police officer who makes arrests of 7 people. They have been charged with certain crime, and we do not see a statement from the UIDI about even denying or confirming the incident. Now, same thing has happened, 3 days back. There was a disclosure by one of the security companies in India that Indian local registrar for names and numbers has been compromised, and the databases have been compromised with the passwords, and there have been screenshots of researcher are able to log in into the individual organizations and then selling it on the dark web. And there's a detailed blog with screenshots he has made available. One of the wonderful blogs I've read. And then in the response, if you look at the statement from the authority or the NIXI, the National Internet Exchange of India, they simply deny everything. So while you talk about incentivizing or while you talk about having some sort of rewards in place, the best reward is that accepting that an incident has happened and then taking an action taken on and then appreciating the person notified the breach. As long as we have a scenario where the organizations or the institutions have a liberty whether to accept the breach or deny the breach or simply not talk about it, this model will not work. Any sort of reward or incentive can only come in once you accept that there has been a breach. So my suggestion is that we have to focus on a policy which also runs straight to the organizations, make them responsible of accepting disclosures, accepting breaches, and then also telling the public what action they have taken.
Thank you so much. We have about 10 to 15 minutes left on the panel, so if there are any audience questions, we'd now be taking them. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thanks for the excellent panel. Can I make some observations?
Yes, absolutely.
I am extremely honored to be present in the distinguished company of esteemed panel of this nature and with old friends. I fully endorse what my old friend Ram Mohan mentioned about the trust element, so much so that I just mentioned the need for trust. Why is that word missing around the room to my good friend Deepak from Symantec about 3 minutes before Ram used that word. So it's like, therapy, some synergy in the room based on what be discussed. On the element of trust, I just want to share an experience from Sri Lanka, where the national CERT realized over a period of time, when it was established in 2006, that the banks and the financial institutions would not share incidents that easily due to the three elements that Ram mentioned. So the skills, together with the integrity aspect and the benevolence aspect, was built in over a period of time. And gradually, what was done is to work with the bank regulator to establish a sectoral CERT called the FinCERT.
Yes. Yes.
And the FinCERT eventually became an interesting framework under a governance regime administered jointly by the central bank and the national CERT.
Yes, so that's a suggestion that has now also been discussed by the Indian government in this budget, and apparently we are expecting a FinCERT
I'm aware of that,
soon as well.
and the FinCERT experts here were invited to India, which was a very good sign of mutual cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. And I think that governance model led to a scenario where the anonymized data from the bank is fed on a day-to-day basis.
Definitely.
And the board of governors sit, and I'm part of that too, with the central bank under their supervision. And eventually the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in 2015 adopted a bank security standard, a baseline security standard, which every single licensed financial institution, that is about 32 of them, would have to follow. And the regular audit, annual banking supervision audit, is based on that criteria. Right. So that's an interesting model.
Yes,
second point.
So, I mean, we have many questions on the room and we don't have too much time. I'm so sorry, so I'll have to cut you off. Any other questions? Saikat, you had a question.
Thank you for this excellent panel, and it was very insightful. I just had a question based on an incident. For example, the Hitachi payment systems hack, which we have heard a lot about. If you look at the events, first it started with a denial, then it started with a partial acceptance, then the first security audit which was carried out by a private company was rejected, and finally 6 months later they had to accept fully the extent of the breach. And I did an investigation and I found out the details of this. Now, and as we know, the government, I think almost 3.2 million was the reported figure, but I think 2.9 is the accepted figure in parliament number of cards which was recalled. So in a situation like this, where does the panel stand? I mean, it's good to have an incentivization of reporting, but these are also has real consequences for the economy, for national security. So where is the balance and how do we achieve that balance? Especially where, as Jiten has pointed out, government agencies are very shy of reporting themselves. And I think a year ago, Bruce Schneider had raised this issue when Symantec mentioned that 3 Indian entities have been hacked, which were all government, and yet there was no clarity on which those entities are.
Saikat, that also brings us to a question. Tomorrow, if there is an incident or a vulnerability which a researcher or a hacker finds, and if he doesn't want to report to that organization, what if he just wants to publish? For the sake of very reason that if he informs the organization, they may simply brush it under the carpet. And that is, I think, where the biggest trust deficit lies. That researchers often feel that if they reveal something, forget incentive, they might actually be arm twisted and everything issue, may be every a single report they give may be simply thrown into the dustbin or brush aside. And there will be, forget acceptance, there may be public denials of such an incident. So, and that may eventually force him to go public with such a thing. So, he might decide to short-circuit the entire process and simply decide not to report. And that's the fundamental reason I was raising that, governments have to set examples first by admitting the breaches instead of preaching others how to report and how to act.
Ram, would you like to respond to both Saikat and Jiten?
Yeah, sure. Saikat, what we have seen time and time again is this pattern, and I find a very similar pattern to loss. You have denial, then you have grief, and eventually you get to acceptance, right? It's a very similar thing. Companies and governments in general, there's a very human element there. You have lost something. It was in your care, and you were expected to safeguard it. You failed. Now, the first thing that happens is a very human reaction is to say, it wasn't me. And then the next thing to say is, well, maybe I had it, but it was them. And then the next thing after that is to say, well, it's happened to everybody, right? And I think that is kind of what is happening right now. And the underlying thing is what Jiten was talking about. If I am somebody who has to disclose, and if I have to worry about being penalized, right, number one. Or even worse, I don't get penalized, but the next time I am kind of labeled a troublemaker. I am kind of bringing up bad news, right? And everybody wants to just hear good news. But you know, with the online world, with digitization, bad news is actually the norm, and good news is the exception. And you know, until we actually get to a common awareness that software is buggy, systems will break, operations will create opportunities for entrance, until we get to that fundamental awareness, I think what you're talking about is going to remain, the human condition is going to become the online condition. Denial, and then eventually, at the very end, acceptance and disclosure.
From the legal perspective, on one hand, it's the person, it's a trust deficit even of that company or by the company in not disclosing. But the reason could be also the financial aspect, where they are so worried about the liability that is going to get foisted on them with the disclosure that they try their level best to postpone that problem. One alternative or a possibility which could emerge to resolve this uncertainty is some certainty in implementation of existing regulatory regimes. So if the rules actually say that if you fail to report within a reasonable time, again, everything seems to be given a lot of leeway by just leaving it to reasonable, right? So if you do not report within a reasonable time, you can be held liable. So here, what are we seeing today? We are not seeing enough implementation of the rules. We are not seeing enforcement. So if there is certainty in enforcement, if there is fear of further liability, not just from persons who are affected by the breach, but also from a statutory body, then the chances of certainty in reporting or complying with that may increase.
Yes.
And if can I just jump in on that really quickly too, and actually tie it together with the previous comment. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and to go back to the trust aspect of things as well. I mean, Jain mentioned that they set up a fin CERT in Sri Lanka. I mean, in the United States, for over a decade, we've had what we call, ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, which are generally sector-specific, but there's a financial services ISAC, communications sector. I've worked with the IT sector ISAC quite a bit, and recently there was an executive order to promote the development of even more private information sharing and analysis organizations, so another acronym. But the key is, over years, they've really built trusted communities, and even though maybe publicly disclosing a vulnerability is not something that all companies want to immediately embrace, or even sharing with the government, who they might not trust, within those trusted communities, I think more sharing can happen, and that's something that I think we probably need more of in India and everywhere, quite frankly. And then also just to put a plug in for establishing more of a risk management culture at companies, broadly, because the days of denying that you're going to get hacked should be over by now, right? So you need to figure out how to identify, protect your networks, but then detect the threats and respond and recover. I mean, it's just so important. And if we change the culture, I think that can help too. Yes.
Hi, my name is Vikas. I work for a company called Science. So in countries like UK, US, EU, most of the financial companies, financial industry companies, right, they go for cyber insurance, where that kind of promotes cyber hygiene for companies. So can that be used as a stick and carrot approach that you are talking about? Will that work? What are your thoughts on that?
It may be inevitable for India now because of this RBI circular which has come out, where a lot of liability has been moved over to the banks as opposed to the customers, for various breaches, etc. So the alternative that is left with the financial sector, the banks to be very specific, is to resort to cyber insurance. But they cannot just rely only on cyber insurance, because that's just going to become more and more expensive for them if they have repetitious breaches or violation. So as you rightly pointed out, what I feel it may lead to going forward is cyber hygiene and better, reasonable best practices, etc., rather than just talking about the issues after the horse has bolted.
Thank you. Any more questions? Anyone? Yes.
I have a,
Yes. Okay. I'll take you second. Yeah.
I have a question. I come from Africa, but we've had a mandatory mobile phone SIM card registration by the government, and the government keeps this data somewhere. My question to the panelists is that the private companies which invest so much money into research usually are ahead of the government in research. But when we trust our data with the government, are we sure that it's safe, especially when we trust them? Because, for example, in our SIM card registration in Uganda, would give them a parent's name, your wife's name, your children's name, and all this data, you pass it on to them. They are not as much well-funded in research, and then we are trusting them with data and letting the hackers and the bad guys waiting for government to come on board. What's your take on that question?
Yes, Ram, please.
Look, I think the governments have a good motivation for this. And I think we should, in this area, we should be focusing a little bit less on the government itself and focusing, as Nappinai was saying, a little bit more on who else has access to the data and where else will the data travel. You have data that is gathered this year and everybody is focused on that. But what about the data that was gathered 5 years ago? Is it sitting somewhere? Has it been archived somewhere? Is it in safe hands? What is going to happen to that data? In most places, there is neither openness nor transparency about it. And so long as that condition is not met, I think that it is very hard for you as a citizen or you as a corporation to truly trust that any entity, whether it's a government entity or a non-profit entity, can actually be trusted with your data.
If I could just sum it up in just one line, I would say that in addition to capacity building, which Udbhav mentioned, I think what we really need to ensure disclosures and how it is handled is confidence building.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Asim from Pi2 Labs. So I heard a lot of discussion about creating a process and creating a plan for it. There is already an ISO standard 29147 for responsible vulnerability disclosure. So instead of, why don't we just adopt it instead of reinventing the wheel every time? It clearly defines the responsibilities and roles of the finder or the person who's going to report it, as well as the vendor, and the process to be followed as soon as a request comes in with a vulnerability or an incident. So why don't we just discuss it with the government to
I think it's a good idea because,
Yes,
NCAPC CERT, everybody keeps coming up with different standards. If we can, the only thing is that standard government has to adopt it through an executive order or a legislative policy. It cannot be organization specific. So that's a wonderful idea, yeah. Why reinvent the wheel?
Yes, sir. You can have your question. Second last one and then the last one with you. Thank you.
My question is to Nappinai ma'am. Ma'am, I am working in the field of cybersecurity right now. Since last 7 years, I was working in the field of human rights. And a few days ago, I received an email from an officer of my district that sent this information. He wrote in his email that I have some issues by old email account. Please send this information to me within 30 minutes on this new email address. Because I am working in the field of cybersecurity and alarm rang in my mind, I made a phone call to that officer and I just confirmed. Did you send that mail? He scolded me. He said, yeah, I have sent that mail. My name and my mobile number is written on in the bottom of the email. Then I just did an experiment. That officer was having 250 stakeholders, which has uploaded the data of 1,000 persons per stakeholder on a portal. I wrote an email. I generated a new email address and wrote an email to all the 250 stakeholders and just requested that I am that one officer. My old email account has some issues.
Could you phrase it as a question, because we're completely out of time. So
Okay.
could you have because I think we got the context. If you could tell us the question, we could help you answer it.
And our portal is also having some issues. Please send me your user IDs and passwords. And I got all 250 user IDs and passwords, which are having details of 2.5 lakh persons. How can we tackle with that?
Can you tell the question that you have on this?
Ma'am, how can we tackle with the situation? Like we are having the scene of forgery of emails. CERT has issued some guidelines that top government officials should use the email addresses on NIC server,
Right.
but
So
officers
then
using Gmail only.
Yes, I've got the question.
Thank you. Yes, could we have your question? That's the last one.
Okay, it's my comment is actually directed at the lawyer. My name is George. I'm from Nigeria. Now, in your intervention, you said part of the problem India has with the Budapest Convention is the fact that you did not join in the negotiations. I just wanted to bring it to the table that now, you may not have negotiated the convention, but then there are several other countries that did not negotiate the convention, but based on the principles, the trust, the framework that the convention sets out, several countries have been invited. Nigeria, for one, did not participate in negotiation, but we aligned with some of the principles, and we have been invited to accede to that convention. Now, I was just thinking that from a national perspective, would it not be better if you looked at the principles set out, and if you agree with them basically in principle, you can then come on board. Remember that Article 37 of the convention also gives you the leeway to make reservations on points that you very strongly disagree with. I just thought it should be on the table.
Thank you, sir. So, I mean, just because we're also about to wrap up the panel, if starting with Jiten, we could have about 30 to 45 seconds maximum of final statements about anything you may want to say about the topic or to respond to any of the questions that you may not have had an opportunity to do so.
Nappi is a better person to respond to that, but I'll only say that, as I said in the entire panel to sum up, that as Asim also rightly pointed out, we must have a responsible disclosure policy. No need to reinvent the wheel. We can pick up an existing standard, but it is now, the time has come to notify it officially through an executive order or a policy framework, and then only we must move forward.
Thank you, Jiten. Ram?
Just two things. One is coordination on a global level, and the second is the elements of trust. I think those are really the 2 points I'd like to for you to carry forward with you. Without either of them, I think any kind of disclosure will only depend upon some regulatory framework and will fall short of the real goals.
John?
Sure. I mean, again, I would jump on the trust point for sure. I think the question about the Budapest Convention actually raises some of these very same issues again. I mean, we talked a lot about the need to create trusted communities and trusted relationships to share this type of information. And naturally, there are going to be questions for those who didn't participate in the formation of the Budapest Convention, about, well, is there going to be two-way sharing? Is the information I share going to be secure, et cetera? And I would also just reiterate that, not to look at this simply through a regulatory lens and to really think about ways of incentivizing voluntary sharing, and included in that liability provisions, but then also addressing the privacy, the data privacy aspects of this debate is going to be very important as India, at the same time, is considering privacy and data protection legislation.
Thank you.
Yeah, so to address your question first, sir, it's not as if India has shied away from the provisions of the Budapest Convention. They have substantially adopted a lot of the positive aspects of the convention. As far as the benefits that accrue, the gentleman sitting right next to you is a witness to that. I was speaking to him earlier about how much Sri Lanka has benefited. In fact, they didn't participate in the negotiations also. But the bottom line is it's the trust deficit, which was what I was highlighting in my statement. The same trust deficit that is there between a government to a corporate is the trust deficit which countries have inter se when they are talking cooperation, and therefore they need to have certainty. So I would close this session from my perspective on two notes, which will also answer the question that the other gentleman raised. I think what we really need when we are talking about trust here is transparency and certainty, and that will also address the question that came up earlier. Whether we are talking about implementation of national or municipal laws or regulations, or we are talking about international cooperation, what I see as stumbling blocks are lack of transparency and uncertainty about what the outcome of something that we do today is going to be. So today, if we can have clarity and transparency in local laws and regulations, have simple definitions which any person can understand and therefore abide by. Similarly, transparency and certainty in international cooperation, I would say that it would be a huge, it would ease the way in moving forward.
Thank you so much. I think we're now going to call the session to a close. Thank you, ORF, for giving us this platform, and the audience for being such an excellent and receptive audience to the panel. Thank you.